During early Victorian times, medical students had few opportunities to dissect bodies as part of their studies. During this period, the only cadavers that were given to teaching hospitals and colleges would be corpses of criminals. However, there were not enough criminals being executed by the late 19th century. Students needed hundreds of corpses for their courses each year, but less than 100 bodies were actually available. Now this led to a new business initiative, body snatching. Criminals began by digging up recently buried corpses and selling them on to the hospitals and colleges. But when demand continued to outstrip that supply, some went a step further and started to kill people so that they could sell their bodies. Now the most famous body snatchers in the country were Burke and Hare, who worked in Edinburgh in Scotland. A group of men in Shoreditch in London started their own body snatching business in the East End. These were known as the London Burkers, after Burke and Hare. Now, the London Burkers were composed of four main men: John Bishop, Thomas Williams, Michael Shields and James May. And they worked as body snatchers, or resurrection men as they were known, for over 10 years. They would often go to pubs to meet people. They would start talking to them and then invite them home under some pretext. When the victim got there, they would be drugged with laudanum, beer or rum, and then murdered. Now colleges didn't ask too many questions about where the bodies came from, as they were in desperate need of them. The London Burkers sold corpses on a regular basis to famous institutions such as St Bart's. Many graveyards around the proximity of these hospitals built watchtowers that were guarded at night by armed people. This led to the rise of the saying, the graveyard shift, for night working. People were determined to protect the graves of the newly deceased friends and relatives. The rich could afford heavy tombstones, vaults, mausoleums and iron cages around the graves. The poor began to place flowers and pebbles on the graves to detect disturbances. They dug heather and branches into the soil to make disinterment more difficult. Large stones, often coffin-shaped, were placed over the graves, as digging around these would take time. However, all these precautions did not deter the body snatchers. The unsavoury trade only came to an end after the sensational trials in the late 1820s of Burke and Hare and London's own murderer and resurrectionist, John Bishop. The Anatomy Act of 1832 ended the body snatching. However, when one problem ended, another began. So Victorian England was a dirty, unsanitary place, and this was also true of graveyards. The dead often spilled over into the living, quite literally. Now, burials were the norm in England, as cremations were an unfamiliar tradition. As death rates in Victorian England were high, there was a difficulty in finding room for an ever-increasing number of corpses. In the cities like London, population was increasing, and along with that, so was death. Burials were done in churchyards, and these were rapidly filling up. Coffins were stacked one atop the other in 20-foot deep shafts, the topmost mere inches away from the surface. Graveyards were an awful place to be in Victorian England. In order to make room for newcomers, putrefying bodies were frequently dismembered or destroyed. Along with the tombstones lay disinterred bones that had been dropped by grave diggers who had been negligent. Clearance of long-buried bones had always taken place, but the growing demand for burials in crowded grounds meant the work became ever more grisly. Smashed coffins had been used for firewoods by the poor, lay scattered around the graveyard. Because burial fees constituted a large part of income, clergymen and sextons turned a blind eye to the worst practices. If one peered too closely into the gravedigger's work, macabre scenes awaited. As more bodies were interred into the grounds began to rise. Wander around a graveyard in Britain, and you will often see that the ground around it is higher than the church itself. This is because the ground in these churchyards are full to bursting of the dead. Graveyards were often foul-smelling places and was thought to be the cause of ill health in neighbouring communities. There was gas emanating from rotten corpses, and those that were just below the surface would expel the gases into the air. It was not uncommon for undertakers to drill holes in coffins in church vaults so they would not explode. Gas could indeed prove fatal to the graveyard workers. When they broke into bloated coffins, they were occasionally suffocated by the release of the cadaverous vapours. Some churches that were in slums were said to have undertaken malpractice with the dead. Some contained a modest cellar under the places of worship where the deceased were laid to rest in their thousands. It was like a conveyor belt for the dead. Old corpses were regularly surreptitiously cleared away to make way for new interments. These coffins were stuffed unceremoniously up the corner, often dumped one on top of the other. In the tomb vaults, mangled coffins produced body bugs which sprang from the corpses and lurked in hair and clothing. Worshippers reported strange smells and tastes during services, and often held handkerchiefs to their noses as they praised the Lord. Some of the redundant remains were dumped in sewers that ran directly under the building. Victorian England was mainly fed water through hand pumps from wells. Wells and water near graveyards were often contaminated with decomposition fluids. The locals recognised the water had a certain taste to it, but drank it anyway as it was their only supply. Now we're going to move on to a man called George Alfred Walker, who would acquire the nickname the Graveyard Walker. He was the first person to really link graveyards with ill health and pollution. He petitioned the Home Secretary, denouncing graveyards as laboratories of malaria and so many centres of infection, constantly giving off noxious afflua. Thanks to his campaigning, the subject would go on to receive detailed parliamentary scrutiny. Although it was thought not to produce instant death, as Walker had suggested, the party had agreed that the smell and its effects could not be denied. By the late 1840s, it was generally accepted that urban graveyards were a danger to human health. It was a resurgence of cholera in the capital that finally persuaded ministers that action was needed. The committee recommended immediate action. They banned the act of burying the dead in amongst the living. They stated they were bringing in legislations to close church vaults, churchyards and burial grounds within the cities, and introduce legislation requiring parishes to build one or more large public cemeteries, and they stipulated that they needed to be situated beyond the built-up cities and managed by a central commission. So this is how in London the Magnificent Seven cemeteries were born, and they were then in what was the edge of the city. The price of funerals were then reduced, but there was still vast money to be made from death, and as you can imagine, the owners of the private grounds closed by the government were not going to go quietly. They were, after all, losing the entirety of their business. So an example of that is that of Mr. Jones. Now, he was the proprietor of the new Bunhill Fields in Upper Street, Islington in London. He alleged that the parliamentary notice had instructed him not only to close but to clear the ground. However, this was not true. He was hoping that he may be able to use the land to build on and make money that way. He began to disinter bodies. The children in the nearby school were treated to the sight of broken coffins, bones and slimy matter that seemed to be alive with maggots. The instructions about Jones's ground from the Home Office were actually that the site should be covered with 2 feet of earth, sown with grass and intercut with asphalt paths to create pleasant walks for the public. However, old Mr. Jones, he did not listen. By 1856 he was found to be taking down tombstones and monuments and selling them for what they would fetch. And by 1858 the walls had been demolished, brickworks removed and the ground given over to local scavengers to be used as a rubbish dump. Rubbish dumps happened to most, if not all, of the abandoned burial grounds. Throughout the years and as London grew, green space became so rare that many of these graveyards were cleared. The tombstones that were left were placed around the edges against the wall of the graveyard and they became much needed green space, a place where Londoners could come and picnic or rest away from city life. London's landscape was transformed by large cemeteries on the outskirts of the city within a few years. These cemeteries were named the Magnificent Seven. They were more like open parks. In addition to being spacious, well ventilated and well maintained, these graves were free from disease and odours. The open spaces and manicured lawns of the cemetery were enjoyed by Victorians. However, this did not last. In the 1830s, famous garden cemeteries like Highgate were built to replace foul local burial grounds, but these failed to make profits for shareholders and soon fell into disrepair. Sadly, the Magnificent Seven graveyards were attacked by thieves, vandals, and were ignored by the general public. A few of their grand chapels had been demolished, whilst others stood forlorn and in ruins among the tombs. Nowadays, the decay of these cemeteries is managed. However, on a recent visit to Abney Park, we can say that there was not a lot of management, and this video is coming up, so watch out for that, because I was quite upset by the state of it. A forest has toppled over gravestones, and the only managed part seemed to be the paths winding through. There were flowers still on the graves from families who have fought through the trees and brambles to find the graves of their relatives. This was a very sad sight for a cemetery. So there we have it, graveyards from the Victorian era right up until now. Like I say, watch out for the Abney Park one, that will be hitting YouTube soon. And thank you for watching.